order to protect its members. But of course Ukraine isn't currently, although it does want to be, the current Ukrainian government is not currently a member of NATO, so NATO is not able to see that itself, but the NATO member that's most important, the US, is watching it. We also know that there has been this phone conversation between President Obama and President Putin, a pretty lengthy conversation they had. President Obama currently not actually at the White House. He's on a trip, he's in Delaware, which is where Air Force One is, and I'm sure he's using his very well-equipped plane as his command center to make these secure phone calls to his Russian counterpart. I suspect there will be a period of all of the world leaders taking stock, trying to gather information before they come out with their view on who was responsible for this, and then I think you'll start to hear the condemnation. Then I think you'll start to see in Brussels NATO ambassadors meet at the North Atlantic Council. You'll see in New York the UN Security Council. I see no doubt that in the coming days there is likely to be a Security Council emergency meeting on this subject. Whether it takes place today, Thursday, I think is not probably likely, because they want to just make sure they have all of the facts before they rush to judgment.
All right, James Bayes in London there. You're watching Al Jazeera. I'm Fully Batibo. It's coming up to 1700 GMT, and we have a special continuing coverage of the Malaysia passenger plane that's crashed in eastern Ukraine. This plane crashed in the east with 295 passengers and crew on board. The Ukrainian government says it was hit by a missile. The president of Ukraine has said the military was not involved. Now, this is one of the first images of the plane, which is said to show debris from the downed airliner, images that we can't independently verify. Wreckage has reportedly also been found in the village of Grabovo in eastern Ukraine, not far from the border with Russia.
There will be a period of all of the world leaders taking stock, trying to gather information before they come out with their view on who
is reported as saying that at least 100 bodies have been found so far. Debris from the wreckage is said to be scattered across an area of up to 15 kilometers in diameter. Rory Challens is in Moscow for us. Rory, tell us about the reaction in Moscow, if any, and also what more you're hearing about this crash.
Well, I just want to talk a little bit about the blame game, because it's just had another little bit of information coming in on that. There are two separate regions in eastern Ukraine that have broken away from the rest of Ukraine, the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic. We heard already from the Donetsk People's Republic earlier on saying that they had nothing to do with this crash. They said that they don't have any weaponry that could have brought down a plane flying at that altitude. The man pads that they have, that's a type of missile system, they can only reach 3,000 to 4,000 meters, and this plane apparently was flying at some 10 kilometers up in the air. So now we've also heard from the Luhansk People's Republic, and what they are saying is that this was not brought down by a missile that came from the ground. They are saying that this was shot down by a fighter plane, by a Su-25, a Sukhoi 25. Now that is a plane that the Ukrainian military has in some abundance and has lost a couple of over the last few days. Two of those went down yesterday, and the Ukrainian army has been blaming the shooting down of those Sukhoi 25s on the separatists themselves. So we can see there's just a web of blame and a web of finger pointing that's starting to build up around this situation that is complicated by the conflict that's going on, and has been complicated also by what's been happening in the last few days. Planes falling out of the sky, the Ukrainian government blaming the pro-Russian separatists, and also blaming Russia itself, saying that Russia has shot down some of its warplanes. This is just an absolute kind of magnification of that, and taking this blame game to a whole different scale.
All right, Rory, joining us from London now is Andrew Brooks. He's an aerospace analyst and director of Aviation Matters. Andrew, thank you very much for being with us. Andrew, first question, Andrew, is it common for a civilian aircraft to fly over such a dangerous zone?
Well, the international aviation community pushes out warnings. I don't quite know what the warning was for the upper airspace over the Ukraine, but normally, if it's dangerous, people divert round it. They dogleg round it. So, but then there's been no question, as far as I'm aware, of anybody threatening an airliner on its lawful business.
But there have been reports of fighter jets, Ukrainian fighter jets being brought down in that same area, the Ukrainians say by the Russians, which the Russians have denied, of course. Given what's been happening in the last few weeks, wouldn't it have been, wise perhaps to tell aviation, the civilian aircrafts not to fly around that area?
Well, with hindsight, it was obviously they shouldn't have done. I don't know what the international aviation authorities have said about avoiding the Ukrainian airspace. It's diplomatic, this, you see. You've got to be very careful about closing down people's airspace without their cooperation. But generally, at 30-odd thousand feet, that airliner should have been perfectly safe.
Rory, joining us
the
from
battles
London
you're talking
now
about, the shooting down the SU-25s, that's all down in the weeds. That's down at 3,000–4,000 feet. Way up there is usually inviolate, and there's no reason why anybody sane should want to, if you like, bring the conflict up to 6 miles up in the air.
Tell us about this airline. It's a Boeing 777, I'm told, and this is also, it was also a Boeing 777, the Malaysia flight MH17 that disappeared en route from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing was also a Boeing 777. Tell us about the airline and you know how it could go down in the face of such a disaster.
Well, you see, an airliner is very vulnerable. I mean, it's like it has no defensive aids. It's not designed to get out of trouble. It sits there sedately going along. The question has to be asked: who fired? If this is a missile, forget this is not a fighter that's gone in and shot it down. This is a missile that's been launched, and only 2 people in the area have that sophisticated capability: the Ukrainians and the Russians. The Ukrainians are hardly likely to shoot down anything over their own territory, especially one that's palpably obvious coming out of Amsterdam. So the question has to be asked: why have the Russians, sophisticated power that they be, decided to shoot down an airliner?
Well, we don't know that yet because the Russians are denying any involvement in shooting down this airline. Of course,
but nobody else can get up that high. So nobody else can get up that high apart from the Ukrainian military. This isn't a toy that's given to sort of goons and terrorists. It's far too sophisticated for them. Only a professional military force can operate this particular surface-to-air missile. And there's only 2 in town that could have done it: the Ukrainians and the Russians. Okay. Now, whoever of them did it, one has to wonder why they would have done it.
Andrew, let me ask you about what this does to Malaysia Airlines. As we've said, this is a second incident in recent months involving Malaysia Airlines. What does this mean for the company, and can they recover from such a tragedy?
What you really need to ask is, why will anybody fly anything over that part of the world? Right. It's not Malaysian Airlines at fault. Somebody's got to start saying, is any civilized nation going to send an airliner into that part of the world where grown governments actually will kill up to 300 people for one purpose? Now, that's the fundamental question. You can say it could be the Ukrainians. I don't think it's the Ukrainians at all. I happen to think it is the Russian government. Why would the Russian government do that? Has it lost control? Are the forces with it? Those are the serious questions that need to be asked, not, dare I say, picking on poor old Malaysian Airlines, who unfortunately have had 2 terrible accidents thrust upon them.
All right, Andrew, thank you very much for your insight. Again, very important to point out that we don't know yet who's responsible for downing this plane, and there's been denials from both the Russians and the Ukrainians. Russians denying being involved, and the Ukrainians as well. Our diplomatic editor James Bays is with us. James, just to remind our viewers of the current context, the political context and the military context in this area where this plane went down.
Yes, well, this, as you say, is a war zone. It's been a period of significant tension, some of the worst tension since the Cold War, but I think this is a real watershed moment. I think that's why right now in capitals around the world people are taking stock, trying to gather information. Our colleagues in Washington, D.C. are getting some information and some reaction. The Secretary of Defense, U.S. Secretary of Defense, has been informed, and his spokesman says we're aware of reports of the downing of the aircraft. We're also getting information from the White House, and this is interesting, Folly, after what you heard from Andrew Brooks there, our aviation expert, his view that the Russians were responsible. We're beginning to find out, it seems, how President Obama found out about this. You'll remember that 24 hours ago it was the US and EU who decided to put sanctions in place against Russia. Well, following that, there was a phone call between President Putin and President Obama, we think originally aimed to discuss that issue. We're told the tone of that phone call was businesslike. Well, White House reporters have been told it was near the end of that phone call that President Putin noted the early reports of the downing of a passenger plane. That suggests to me, and we'll get confirmation as the hour goes on from our team in Washington, D.C., it seems from those reports that we're getting that the first President Obama heard about this was from President Putin.
Okay, we will be speaking to our correspondent in Washington, D.C. just right now. In fact, Patty Culhane is there for us. Patty, what more are you hearing about this conversation that President Obama had with the Russian president?
I'll go back and circle back and double check with White House officials, but it seems very unlikely that the president would pick up the phone and speak with Russian President Vladimir Putin without being aware of that. We do know that as he was leaving the White House to get onto Marine One to travel to Air Force One, reporters shouted out the question. If he had any comment on that, he chose not to speak to reporters at that time. But again, the White House is saying that there was this phone call, that the Kremlin asked for it to talk about sanctions. And at the end of the call, they discussed the downed plane in Ukraine. That's pretty much all they said about that, not what the conversation back and forth was. But at the same time, we also are being told by the White House that as of now, President Obama has no plans to change his schedule. He's going to be speaking in about 2 hours about infrastructure, and then he's got a full evening of fundraising in New York City. Obviously, if this becomes more of a crisis, we do expect that his schedule would change. He'd come back to the White House. That's usually what they do, but we'll be keeping an eye on it for you.
Okay, Patty, thank you very much indeed. Patty Culhane live for us there in Washington as we continue to watch these pictures which are being aired on Russian television, the pictures of the area where Malaysia flight MH17 is said to have crashed with 295 people on board. As you can see, this happened in a vast area that looks like a field, lots of smoke billowing. There are reports of bodies, charred bodies being found near the town of Grabovo in eastern Ukraine along the border with Russia. Joining us now also from Washington, D.C. is Larry Korb. He's a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense. Larry, good to have you on Al Jazeera. Of course, it's early days. There's a lot of information that we still don't have, a lot of questions that need to be answered. But just diplomatically first, how do you see this all playing out between the U.S. and Russia?
Well, I think the real key thing is, did the Russians give this sophisticated equipment to these rebels in Ukraine, or were there some Russian people there? And I think this gets to the whole question like we've had with people say, well, you should send anti-aircraft weapons to the people in Syria. No, if they fall into the wrong hands, you've got a big problem. And I assume that's what President Obama and President Putin were talking about. Do you really control this equipment?
Right, but obviously we don't know yet whether or not the Russians were involved, but a Ukrainian Interior Ministry official is saying that this plane was downed by a medium-range surface-to-air missile, a BUK. From your experience, Larry, who could own such a weapon, and where would it come from?
Well, it probably came from Russia. The question was, did the Russian military still have control, or did the rebels who were allied themselves with Russia? Because as has been pointed out in your previous discussions, they did fire in the last couple of days at a Ukrainian aircraft. So
which
we know
denied,
that they have this. Well, I know they denied it, but the fact of the matter is that you have very sophisticated weapons in the hands of somewhat irresponsible people. Whether the Russians are still controlling them or whether it's just the rebels doing it on their own, that's what we have to find out here.
What sort of reaction do you anticipate the Americans, the U.S., will have if it is confirmed that this perhaps was no accident, that it was deliberate, and that the Russians may have been behind it? We are, of course, speculating, but what sort of reaction could we expect?
Well, I think what we're going to say is to President Putin, you've got to get this equipment back under your control, or else you're going to face further sanctions, which is what the president announced yesterday. I think in the final analysis, these people probably thought it was a Ukrainian aircraft and, decided to attack it. I don't think they wanted to get a Malaysian aircraft, but that's what happens when you give this equipment or you lose control of this particular equipment.
All right, Larry, thank you very much for the time being. Larry Korb there in Washington, D.C. for us. Let's just recap this breaking news story that we're continuing to cover here on Al Jazeera. Malaysia Airlines flight MH17 has crashed